Bioethics 2.0, Podcast Episode 4, The Introduction to the Clinical Pragmatism Framework. Bioethics 2.0 Podcast Episode Guide. This is Podcast Episode 4, Clinical Pragmatism. You can find this information in Introduction to Clinical Ethics by Fletcher, also known as the ICE, in Appendix 2. Clinical Pragmatism.
While there are a variety of clinical ethical frameworks that can be used to resolve moral difficulties, one, called the Clinical Pragmatism Framework, that can be found in the Introduction to Clinical Ethics textbook by Fletcher, that most closely resembles the methods of nursing and medical diagnosis. So doctors and nurses will already be familiar with this method of ethical analysis. This slide takes you through the 4 steps of the Clinical Pragmatism Framework. We will go through these briefly, and then we will spend the rest of the podcast discussing especially Phase 1, assessment of all the things listed on the slide, in more detail, and then we will talk about Steps 3 and 4 as well. The first step of the Clinical Pragmatism Framework is assessment. This includes assessment of medical facts of the situation and what contextual factors exist in a particular case, whether the patient has the capacity for decision-making, what the patient's preferences are, and what the patient's needs are as a person. In addition, this includes assessment of who the surrogate decision-makers are when a patient lacks capacity, whether there are any competing interests, what institutional factors might be in play in a particular place, and the very important component of power. Phase 2 of the Clinical Pragmatism Framework is a moral diagnosis of the problems posed by the case and options for resolution. This moral diagnosis is very much like any other diagnosis a clinician would make. It involves taking into account all the facts of the assessment and trying to make a hypothesis of what the diagnosis could be based on the contextual features of the case, and then what some options might be to provide data so that you can test that hypothesis. In this way, a moral diagnosis is very much like other diagnoses a clinician would make. It is essentially a hypothesis. Phase 3 of the Clinical Pragmatism Framework is where you set goals, where you engage in shared decision-making, where you try and implement a plan of action by means of a shared deliberative process. Phase 4 of the Clinical Pragmatism Framework takes place after the actual case has been resolved. It is where you evaluate your results. We will discuss each of these steps in greater detail.
The use of clinical pragmatism in clinical ethics.
One of the other reasons the Clinical Pragmatism Framework works so well is that it adopts a democratic model of moral decision-making. Since there is not one moral principle that should be used to resolve a case, there is not one view of the moral situation that should take precedence. This helps foster a more inclusive model of moral decision-making. So what happens here is that clinicians, and if they are working with ethics consultants, they help facilitate or guide a process of decision-making without dictating or engineering the outcome. As I said, the moral diagnosis is very much like a hypothesis, and in very much the same way that you use tests and other diagnostic tools to help fill in the gaps and help determine whether or not the original diagnosis of a clinical matter is indeed the case, the same goes with the Clinical Pragmatism Framework. Rather than using an engineered outcome or ethical principles where you already know what the answer is, the Clinical Pragmatism Framework is understood to be located within a context of what we call reciprocity. What this means is that all parties are entitled to be heard. They all need to work together, and they need to arrive at a mutually satisfactory resolution. Ethics committee members who are using the Clinical Pragmatism Framework should promote careful consideration of the range of options that are available. They need to ensure that all concerned parties have an opportunity to be heard and endeavor to mediate conflicts. If you are a clinician and you use the Clinical Pragmatism Framework on your own, the same goes for you. It's also very important to note that not every item on the 4-stage process of clinical pragmatism will be relevant in every morally problematic case. It is provided as a guideline to be all-inclusive, and although the method is presented in a somewhat linear progression, in practice you should know that these steps may occur simultaneously or in a different sequence. You may assess facts after you have a diagnosis, and these are just preliminary guidelines for you.